Thank you all for coming today. My name is Deirdre Locke, and I'm the president of I-SPY, which is otherwise known as Brooklyn Law School Students for Prison Awareness. I-SPY, unlike what some people think, is not actually an acronym for anything. It's just sort of a catchy term for our organization. Anyway, here today we're honored to present District Attorney Charles Hynes and Lisa Schreibersdorf. Lisa is Executive Director of the Brooklyn Defense Services and is also the Vice President of the New York State Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers. District Attorney Hynes has been on the forefront of treatment alternatives for defendants. He's pioneered the DTAP program starting in 1990. The DTAP program is the Drug Alternative Treatment Program. Drug Treatment Alternative to Prisons, which has become a national model for drug treatment alternative programs all across the country. Without further ado, here's the District Attorney.
When Lisa was introduced, she had a booth, at least my students. This is a very, very good turnout, and I am happy there's some interest because it's a very, very serious issue that affects all of us. If not for moral considerations, fiscal considerations. You're all tax-paying citizens, Although most of you are independent, you've been able to pay for your law school with no student loans. I understand that. What I'd like to discuss is, of course, a major legislative enactment, which is among the most misunderstood laws that remain on the statute books, the so-called Rockefeller drug laws. And after I describe their history and their reach, what they're intended to do, and what they have really produced, I'll give you my proposals for their reform which I believe is way long overdue. The history is particularly significant, I think, because it may surprise some of you that Governor Nelson Rockefeller did all in his power to address drug-driven crime in a just and humane manner before turning in frustration to draconian measures, which concerns a lot of people, including me. For example, in 1966, Governor Rockefeller urged that a sweeping legislative initiative removing pushes from the streets and placing addicts in new and expanded state facilities for effective treatment, rehabilitation, and aftercare. That legislation created the Narcotics Addiction Control Commission. In its introductory language, the legislature concluded that narcotics addicts are estimated to be responsible for 1/2 of the crimes committed in the city of New York, and that the problem of narcotics addiction is rapidly spreading into the suburbs and other parts of the state. The legislature further found that narcotics addicts can be rehabilitated. This is 1966. And they can be returned to useful lives only through extended periods of treatment in a controlled environment, followed by supervision in an aftercare program. The 1966 legislation created a 5-member Narcotics Addiction Control Commission and placed it significantly in the New York State Department of Mental Health. And that placement made clear Governor Rockefeller's resolve to treat drug addiction as a malady rather than as a crime. It authorized the commission to establish rehabilitation centers and other facilities for the care and treatment of narcotics addicts. Under the law, a court could certify that a person be placed in the custody and care of the commission if after a medical examination and an opportunity for judicial review, the person was found to be a narcotics addict. The legislation included civil commitments as well as commitments that came after criminal conviction. In his bill signing memorandum, Governor Rockefeller sounded a very hopeful note. He said, "This program represents a balanced approach to combating crime by striking at a widespread cause, narcotics addiction. Moreover," he said, "the new rehabilitation program will help addicts to return to normal, useful, and healthy lives. It is indeed," he said, "a major step towards solving a major health and law enforcement problem." Unfortunately, the law lacked a critical component: job training and job placement. And that omission would prove to be a fatal flaw to this legislative initiative. 3 years later, the governor remained optimistic. In his annual address to the legislature in January 1969, he said, "To meet the challenge posed by narcotics addiction, this administration proposed and the legislature implemented the world's most comprehensive program of mandatory treatment for narcotics addiction. More than half the addicts released to the community from this program have not reverted to the use of drugs." It was a questionable statistic because there was no controlled follow-up. Since the average addict spends more than $30 a day to support his habit, the governor said, and often must steal 4 and 5 times that amount in the value of goods to get the money to buy drugs, the value of this program in reducing crime is apparent. But his optimism eroded swiftly when 5 months later, the governor decided to temper mercy with stern justice. He signed a change in the penal law, which would be a portent of things to come. He approved an amendment which significantly raised the penalties for possession and the sale of dangerous drugs. A new felony was created for the sale and possession of 8 ounces of any defined dangerous drug, raising the maximum penalty to 15 to 25 years, and another new felony was created for selling or possessing 16 ounces of a dangerous drug, carrying a sentence of 15 years to life imprisonment. It was the first enactment of a life imprisonment statute for drugs. But in his May 1969 bill signing memorandum, the governor made clear that the new legislation was intended for hardcore pushers of heroin, morphine, cocaine, and opium, and that the severe penalties were tied to the amount of drugs sold. He said the bills quite properly distinguish between small-scale sellers of hardcore narcotics, who are often themselves addicted to drugs, and large-scale sellers who reap enormous weekly profits from plying their insidious trade. The severity of the increases in penalties that the bills provide is justified, he said, by the nature and the quantity of the drugs involved. The alarming rise in the incidence of the use of narcotics, particularly among young people, and the resultant permanent damage to mind and body requires stern measures commensurate with the seriousness of the crime. We hope that these bills, by substantially increasing criminal penalties for illegal sale and possession of dangerous drugs, may serve as an effective deterrent to the spread of the illicit drug trade. And of course, they did. It was certainly not Governor Rockefeller's intention by any means, but it was the first step into the dark tunnel of despair for thousands and thousands of drug-addicted sick women and men. 2 years later, it was apparent that the substantial increase of criminal penalties had not been effective, had not deterred the illegal drug trade. In his January 1971 message to the legislature, the governor stated, New York's preeminence in treatment and rehabilitation was unquestioned. He noted that over 10,000 addicts were in rehabilitation programs or aftercare programs, and another 9,000 addicts were in public or private programs, funded and accredited by the state. But he observed, despite this massive effort, and despite a number of notable successes, we regrettably are still submerged in the tragedy of drugs and drug addiction. One of the governor's recommendations for solving the drug problem was to create special narcotics pods in the city of New York to speed the handling of cases involving professional trafficking in narcotics and dangerous drugs. In June 1971, the governor acted on this recommendation and created special narcotics pods in the Supreme Courts of the 5 counties of New York City and authorized the 5 district attorneys to appoint a special narcotics prosecutor to deal with inter-county drug trafficking. In its declaration of legislative findings and intent, the legislature concluded that an emergency of grave dimension exists in narcotics law enforcement in the city of New York. What is ironic about this legislative finding is that the number of drug cases in 1971 was small in comparison to the explosion of those cases which occurred in the 1980s. For example, in 1971, the New York State prison population was at 12,525 compared to 57,000 2 decades later and 67,000 today. Just 2 years later, Governor Rockefeller's patience ran out and he approached the drug problem in a way that was a 180-degree turn. Citing drugs and crime as the #1 concern of the American people, saying that our citizens feared for their personal safety and for their property, The governor declared this reign of fear could no longer be tolerated. And so in his 1973 message to the legislature, he said it was time for brutal honesty regarding narcotics addiction. He said after trying every possible approach to stop addiction, through treatment and education, and after allocating $1 billion to education, therapy, and rehabilitation, it was time to tell it like it is. We've achieved very little permanent rehabilitation, and we have found no cure. In his view, all of the laws that were then on the books would not work to deter pushers of drugs. In his view, the choice was either to go on as usual, with little hope of changing the trend, or take stern measures that he'd become convinced were demanded by common sense. In his opinion, society had no alternative but to create what he believed was effective deterrent of pushing of drugs. Life sentences for all pushers, without plea bargaining, without probation, without parole, without the suspension of sentence. On May 8, 1973, he signed the so-called Rockefeller drug laws into effect. The new laws created 3 categories of felonies for the possession and sale of narcotic drugs, any one of which carried a maximum sentence of life in prison. The laws also created a new felony for those convicted twice of possessing 1/8 of an ounce of narcotics drug, and for being convicted twice for selling any narcotics preparation. This new felony carried a mandatory prison sentence that ranged from 4.5 to 9 years and up to 12.5 to 25 years in prison. Under these laws, it was now very clear that draconian penalties were no longer reserved for the major drug dealers who dealt in large quantity of drugs, but could now be imposed on the lowest level of drug dealers, the addicts who sold small quantities of drugs to support their habit. But these increased penalties, which were the most widely publicized portion of the Rockefeller drug laws, were only part of the extensive revision of the laws that profoundly affected and still affect the way drug cases are handled by the criminal justice system. Because of the enactment of the second felony offender law, although this law on its face applied to all felonies and not just drug felonies, its effect on drug defendants has been profound and cruel. Under the second felony offender law, any defendant convicted of a second felony within a 10-year period must receive a mandatory prison sentence. Unlike a sentence for a first offense, which requires a minimum sentence of 1/3 of the maximum, the minimum sentence for a second felony is 1/2 the maximum sentence. In practical terms, this means that for a second felony offender, a low-level drug defendant must receive a sentence of 4.5 to 9 years. The 1973 legislation also gave the governor authority to appoint 68 new Court of Claims judges to exclusively handle drug cases. And although this number has been reduced by subsequent legislation, these appointments continue and have given each succeeding governor more control over the criminal bench. Who sits in the criminal bench than you, the electorate? Since 1973, most of the public's and media attention has been focused on the life sentences that have been imposed under the Rockefeller drug laws, and the defendants serving those sentences are often referred to as the poster children. But the second felony offender law accounts for vastly more drug defendants being sent to state prison. Typically, there are about 600 drug defendants serving life imprisonment sentences in state prison, but the number of second felony offenders is nearly 20,000. And so the question for our discussion is what to do about laws that seemingly don't work, or are debated endlessly without solution. And before I proceed with a brief PowerPoint, one caveat. As most controversial issues, the reform of the Rockefeller drug laws invites the cliche, the devil is in the detail. Any discussion about the Rockefeller drug laws, though, the detail is the devil. So in my view, it is far better to accept the compromise we offer rather than to attempt to deal with every excess of these drug laws. And now, just a few minutes of the PowerPoint. We started DTAP in 1990. Our initial target was nonviolent predicate narcotics defendants who were going to be serving mandatory sentences of 4.5 to 9 years. We deferred prosecution pending 2 years of residential treatment. In 1998, when Ann Swerin took over, she introduced a wonderful innovation. We include nonviolent cases. In any nonviolent case, not just drug cases, we require a felony plea prior to treatment, and we defer the sentence. And if someone falls off the treatment plan, we have a more liberal readmission policy. Okay. It's designed to attack drug addiction for the most difficult defendant population, predicate felony offenders who face mandatory prison sentences under these Rockefeller drug laws. Now, we screen pending cases. Appropriate defendants are generally allowed to plead one count down to a B felony or a C with a prison alternative of 3 to 6 years should they fail in treatment. We adjourn it pending residential drug treatment in a therapeutic community for 15 to 24 months, followed by aftercare and job placement. That's key, job placement. The progress is monitored by our office in partnership with a non-profit management organization under supervision of a judge. Currently, there's a study that's been going on for about 5 years by former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Joe Califano, at Columbia. And I've spoken to Secretary Califano privately. He tells me that there's a very, very favorable report on the success of DTAP about to come out. These are the numbers. 4,665 people have been found eligible. 41% have been rejected by us because of public safety concerns, violent people, people with history of absconding. 27% have refused to participate in the program, rather trying to take a shot at getting an acquittal. And then, of course, we've had 32% of the eligible defendants accepted by DTAP. So 63% of those accepting treatment are either still in treatment, 348, or have graduated, 572, and that becomes a very important figure, the 572. 37% have failed in treatment. A defendant who is successful, they have their plea withdrawn, the case is dismissed. Those who fail are sent to state prison according to the agreed upon terms, unless we think they should be readmitted to the program. Now, this is very important. If someone absconds, we have an enforcement team that has been very, very successful for all of these nearly or over 11 years. 97% are returned to court within 9 days, and that's very important. The preferred prosecution model, before the plea model, 64% remained in treatment. After the policy was changed, it bounced up to 84%. So jail sentence is a real deterrent for this population. Recidivism reduction is astounding, I think. 23% were rearrested compared with 47% who hadn't been exposed to the program. After 5 years, 30% rearrested compared to 56%. And public safety, or the foundation of public safety, in my view, is recidivism reduction by prevention. Okay. This is something that should concern every one of you with a loan. $42,000 for 2 years of treatment. $82,000 wasted in correction, or alleged correction. Of our 572 graduates, correction savings based on 2 years of incarceration, it's phenomenal. The cost of pretrial detention, getting all of the cost of the criminal justice system, $16 million in savings when they go to DTAP. The cost benefits are reflected in health care savings, which are fairly obvious, over $500,000. Public assistance, people who are on public assistance, their families, the savings of $2.2 million. Recidivism savings, $1.6 million where people are not being rearrested. Those are the savings of court, prosecution, defense, pretrial detention, probation, and prison. Tax increases. We have people working, paying taxes, $500,000 a year. So the 572, maybe we should remove that. 572 graduates, that's real cost benefit, $21 million, almost $22 million. And then that's the graph that shows the incredible benefits of DTAP compared to correction. DTAP graduates gets a new start, drug-free, crime-free life, felony cases dismissed, there's job placement, again, the critical piece. They become a member of the Alumni Association. They have continued contact with us. We have an annual graduation, which is, I'll make sure you get notice of it. If you come to the graduation and watch those little children and the families, and you don't shed some tears. You're tougher than I am. Good. The employment component. 92% of our graduates are able to work. Prior to that, only 26%. Now, they earn up to $60,000. These are not counterclaims. You know, at Burger King, we have a whole range of employment opportunities. We have a job developer. You know, people say to me, how the hell do you get involved in jobs? You're a DA. I say, well, how can you not get involved? If you could prevent this population from coming back, look at the cost savings. These are the kind of jobs we have. Human services, mechanics, commercial driving, building maintenance, construction. And we're now dealing with the construction trades to try and come up with a policy that puts them into the, not internship, what do they call it? Apprenticeship. And I want you to listen to this guy.
My name is Frederick Cohen. I am the program director at the Project Return Foundation, where I've been employed for the last 5 years. We are a residential inpatient drug treatment program under the therapeutic community modality. I also work for the National Council for Alcoholism and Drug Dependence as the Healthy Families Coordinator, where we provide prevention curriculums to single parents, teens, and children. That's today. If we go back some 10 years, you'll find a very different Fred Cohen. You'll find a Fred Cohen faced with 4.5 to 9 for a sale of a controlled substance. And thanks to initiatives like DTAP from Kings County District Attorney's Office, Charles Hynes and all the assistants, and Swern, I'm where I am today. And I think that if we can expand these types of programs and introduce them on a national scale, we can turn a chemically dependent, non-productive social liability into a law-abiding, tax-paying asset to our country.
Fred Cohen is the president of our association, our drug treatment graduates. Now, it's so interesting. Fred went down to the Congress with me a couple of years ago. John Miker is a Republican conservative from Florida by way of Binghamton, and is to the right of Attila the Hun. And on that committee was Congressman Bob Barr and Asa Hutchinson, who's now the drug administrator, who's going to be our keynote speaker at this year's graduation. And all, as you know, legitimate liberals, right? Bob Barr was on the impeachment committee. Fred Cohen blew them away. I mean, they came running after him when he got finished. And they introduced legislation, as did Senator Hatch and Thurman, also two well-recognized liberals, along with Leahy, Biden, and DeWine. We had, and with Chuck Schumer, legislation 2 years ago that gave federal funding to a drug treatment program. The bills both passed. They were unreconciled because of the difference in money that was allowable. This year, the beginning of last year rather, we were on target. We had two bills very closely reconciled, and then the tragedy happened on September 11th, and everything went on the back burner. They're slowly beginning to get involved with domestic issues again, and I'm very confident that we're going to get this bill passed. And it's based on DTAP, obviously. So I think that if legislation is passed by the Congress, if the New York State Legislature passes reform based on drug-related crime, we are going to see crime levels plummet to a level that we haven't seen since the 1950s. And we will long last have a sensible alternative to these crimes. Okay, great. Let me wrap up. We have 11 years' experience and data to support our proposals. And it's now increasingly clear to virtually all the prosecutors in New York State, and certainly the Congress, that DTAP provides a solid solution to the reform of the Rockefeller drug laws. It provides a number of lessons about the effectiveness of such reform. Were we to extrapolate the DTAP figures to all second felony offended drug offenders in state prison today, it is clear that thousands and thousands of inmates could be diverted to treatment and many millions of dollars saved in the cost of incarceration, prosecution, welfare, and health care. If 30% of the state's population admitted drug treatment as an alternative to prison, or 6,000 inmates, we're talking about a savings of $250 million a year, or over 2 years, rather. And if we took the 10 times the number of the DTAP graduates, the 572, and they could be successfully rehabilitated, the overall savings to taxpayers like you would be $240 million. But not all drug defendants are addicted to drugs. Many of them sell drugs to make money. Many of them are engaged in violent behavior to protect their turf. So DTAP teaches us there must be careful screening to distinguish between low-level drug dealers who are addicts and those who sell for profit alone. And screening is essential to determine the treatment for those who deserve it and those who cannot have it. It also teaches us, and this is where Lisa and I, my friend Lisa and I disagree, that prosecutors ought to have a say in who gets into these drug programs. If prosecutorial consent is removed, I'm afraid that a lot of my colleagues will not allow reduction in pleas and will never get expansion of DTAP as I see it. And the fact is, and another good friend of mine is the Chief Judge of this New York State Court of Appeals, Judith Kay, who I think is one of the most progressive Chief Judges we ever had. But she goes up and down the state saying the drug courts are immensely successful, and they are, and they require prosecutor consent. There's been no problem that I'm aware of. DTAP also teaches us that drug treatment must be adequately funded. It's ludicrous to speak of treatment alternatives without upfront commitments by the legislature, whether it's here or in the Congress, of at least $20,000 a year for each defendant diverted from the criminal justice system. DTAP teaches us that the addition to the certainty of punishment in the form of mandated prison sentences, the enforcement team is essential to public safety. Drug-addicted criminals and the public alike have to understand that someone who absconds from treatment is going to be apprehended quickly. DTAP also shows that residential treatment must be provided to drug addicts between 15 and 24 months, and to assure transition, there has to be job training and job placement. That is the critical component that was missed in Rockefeller drugs. I wish I had this $1 billion right now to use to expand our programs. I believe that the proven success of DTAP makes it the right model for changes in the Rockefeller drug laws and changes that we consider this year. It's a realistic diversion. It has a successful partnership with the defense bar, the judges, and our office. For the past 6 months, I've been trying to get support of the drug treatment community. It's been very, very positive, from Joe Califano to the heads of the major drug treatment facilities are in favor of this kind of reform. And then finally, given the documented fiscal savings, I believe it is long past time for opinion makers, like lawyers, like you guys, women, like educators, religious leaders, community leaders, get together and say, you know, it's time for a sensible reform. It makes fiscal sense. It's a moral imperative that we ought to get behind. Thank you very much.
I just want to start off by saying I think it's really nice that everybody's coming to hear about criminal justice issues, because most of my experience with law students is that the schools aren't necessarily flushing out very current and important issues that are facing the criminal justice system. And when you graduate, people who are interested in criminal justice graduate law school and kind of come into our criminal justice system and don't really know sort of how different things are interplaying and what's really going on. So I really welcome the opportunity to share my side of it, and and to support your education about sort of things that are happening. Luckily for you, you're hearing all of this from the probably only district attorney in the entire country who feels so strongly about placing people into drug treatment, and who has the kind of statistics in his office that can show you just how important treatment is. And because I'm the executive director of Brooklyn Defender Services, which is a defender office, I often work with Mr. Hynes in his office, Ms. Ann Swan, who often does the programs, and I'm involved in planning drug courts and in planning other programs that will divert people who are my clients who get arrested and then really need drug treatment. And I can tell you, having been a defense attorney for 17 years here in Brooklyn, that before Mr. Hynes came here, before he became the DA here, it wasn't like that. That my clients came to me with the same horrible stories about drug addiction and using drugs, and the decline in their entire lives because of drugs, and their families came to me crying because they had lost their son or daughter to drugs, or they had lost, both of their sons and daughters to drugs, and their cousins and, many other people, and there was nothing that could be done for them because, 17 years ago, the thinking still was that people who sold drugs should go to jail. And the Rockefeller laws, which were still on the books and still are on the books, made it impossible for anybody to veer away from these mandatory minimum sentences that you heard about. I mean, 4.5 to 9 for 1/8 of an ounce of cocaine or for sale of any amount. So if I were to sell you, something that would fit barely in the palm of your hand, and I would sell it to you, and you'd buy it for $10, and I got arrested, I would get probation. But the second time I did it, I could get, the minimum sentence is 4.5 to 9. And I talk about minimum sentences because it's very important to understand what the meaning of a mandatory minimum is. It's a law that's designed to tie the hands of a judge who has been elected or appointed in a very legitimate way to make legitimate decisions about what should happen to the person that comes in front of them. So, if you take criminal law, you know that there's a lot of issues about whose decision is it. If somebody gets arrested, all right, we all know about the jury system. They decide, if the person's guilty or not guilty. But then the judge decides what's the appropriate thing to do with this person. And certainly in Brooklyn, although not everywhere, the largest majority of cases don't actually go to trial, but then everybody sort of arrives at an understanding of what would be best to do with a case, and we arrive at our dispositions through plea bargaining. And that means that a district attorney comes to court, a defense attorney, like myself, who represents this person, a discussion is had with the judge, and amongst the three of us, we sort of agree on what should be done. Now, mandatory minimums tie the judge's hand and make it so that the judge is bound to give, at a minimum, what the law requires. The district attorney, on the other hand, has a little more power because what they can do is they can say, look, what we're going to do is we'll allow the person to plead to a lesser charge, something like what you heard before. You can plead instead of a B felony to a C felony or a D felony. Okay, and by doing that, it sort of drops the mandatory minimum. The Rockefeller laws tie the judge's hands and, in fact, actually tie the district attorney's hands to some extent also because it limits how far down, let's say, a DA can go in negotiating. Now, for many, many years, that's pretty much how drug cases were dealt with. And as you know, there's thousands and thousands of people in jail because the mandatory minimum sentences required them to go into upstate prison. And that was despite many defense attorneys begging for treatment. Now, the DTAP program was started many years ago, but it was a very, very small program when it started, and it was very limited in its use. And over the last 11 or 12 years, the use of treatment as an alternative to incarceration has really expanded. And you've heard the statistics, and I have to vouch for the fact that the opportunity for people who sell very small quantities of drugs to go into treatment as an alternative to jail it's just so humane and so appropriate and so the right thing. And I am so pleased that the statistics support it. Because I'm so glad that I can come in here and totally agree with the DA, that we agree, okay? We just really do. And I don't think you'll find a defense attorney in Brooklyn that doesn't agree. And Brooklyn actually has a national reputation for the fact that people can get treatment and they can succeed in treatment and that everything is lined up properly so that treatment is useful, helpful, and successful. And I just wanted to touch on some of these issues because I think the reform of the Rockefeller laws is a complicated issue that you sort of have to take outside Brooklyn to understand my position. What I want to talk a little bit about was the development of very effective treatment methods, which I have to say, back in 1966, when they tried the original NACC, which you heard about, the problem was that the treatment facilities actually weren't really, good at treating people with drug problems. They tried their best. A lot of people had very good intentions. And, like the DA said, they really didn't have job placement, they didn't have aftercare, there were a lot of things missing from that program. That have subsequently developed. 35 years, we've learned a lot. The treatment providers, the treatment community, the people that have succeeded in treatment, the 12-step communities have multiplied enormously, and all of these communities combine to basically give a working knowledge about how to work treatment. And that's a very, very important thing. One of the most important things that I think has contributed to the ultimate success, the high statistics, is the fact that treatment is not really a linear process. And the understanding of that has really, I think has really sunk in our court system and in our DA's office. That, somebody might be off drugs for 3 or 4 months, and then they might just kind of fall backwards. And they might get back on drugs for a little while, or experiment, or, just have a slip, as they call it. And then, they can get back on the way again and kind of like try to recover again. Many, many people who ultimately succeed have had one, fall backwards. And it's very important that that information be incorporated into our understanding of what treatment should be, because otherwise people will fail. And I can tell you that in many, many counties in this state alone, that the district attorney does not agree that if somebody has one bad moment and we go out there and we arrest them right away and we put them in jail for a few days and then we get them back in treatment, that they can ultimately succeed in treatment and become successful. That most of the district attorneys feel that I gave you a chance and you blew it, therefore now you're going to go do your maximum sentence. And I have to say, as a defense attorney and as somebody who is pretty knowledgeable about this stuff, that is just not the enlightened approach that would get us to a place in the rest of the state that we are in Brooklyn. And if we don't reform the Rockefeller laws in such a way that the judges can make those kinds of decisions and that the judges can get educated about this kind of thing, that I don't think it'll be successful. Now let me just say, I do support DTAP very much. And I do believe that the district attorneys should get funded to provide treatment, because there's another thing that the DAs do that nobody else can do, which is to dismiss a case if the person is successful. And in addition to the job placement, which I think is probably one of the most important components of success, the second biggest component is to have your case dismissed. Because if you go out in New York State with a felony on your record, you won't be able to get a job. And I can tell you something else, there's no law in New York State where somebody's record could be expunged. Meaning that if you get a conviction, you can stay out of trouble for 20, 30, or 50 years. There's nothing that you can do about that. So the opportunity to have that felony conviction expunged from your record entirely, which a dismissal is something that the DA offers that nobody else can do. A judge really can't do that. So I support DTAP because I support the DAs being motivated to do that. But I also really strongly support, and I have to say I speak not just for myself, but I am the vice president of the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and we're an organization of about 1,000 defense lawyers around the state. And we've been lobbying heavily for reform of the Rockefeller laws because we do believe it's harsh and inappropriate to keep these laws on the books any longer. But we really believe that the discretion for who should decide what the minimum should be or what the proper sentence should be the judge. The judge thinks treatment is appropriate, that should be what it is. And the success of the drug courts very much feeds into that. Now, there are drug courts around the entire state, slowly growing in popularity and in success. And the ability for the judge to pick a case out and say, look, this person is screened properly, this person is a drug addict, this person needs treatment, and I will give the person treatment, I think very much goes to the very core of what our system should be. I know the district attorney is an elected official also, but I think that the judges who are elected and appointed to do that, to make that decision, should make that decision. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the other Rockefeller laws, because I think it's important to know that while, yes, a lot of people get treatment and should get treatment, and the Rockefeller laws should be changed so that treatment is an opportunity that's available, there are plenty of other Rockefeller laws, plenty of other people that are affected by those laws that are not drug addicts. And those people really deserve a little bit of mercy also. And I want to talk about that. In some neighborhoods in Brooklyn and around the city, there aren't a lot of opportunities. And it's true that some people go and sell drugs and make money, and that is pretty horrible. But when a young person who's 16 years old or 17 years old or 18 sees that the only person in the neighborhood who has a car, and a cell phone and has a lot of money is the drug dealer, we are dealing with a societal problem that has to be addressed in a way other than, well, when that kid now gets arrested for selling drugs, putting that person in jail for 4.5 to 9, 10 years or 15 to life. I have just seen too many families and this society really destroyed by that. And I think we should really seriously reconsider how we feel about how we're going to deal with that. And another, it is a very small quantity of drugs that amounts to a life imprisonment, the potential for life imprisonment. And when I say life imprisonment, I mean a maximum of 25 to life, but a minimum. The judge's hands are tied to go below 15 to life. 15 to life actually means 15 in jail. You do not get out of jail before 15 without a governor's pardon. Now, I don't know if any of you really know Kentucky. You know, I've covered governor's philosophy, but it's not going to be pardon people. A large majority of people who are doing that kind of time, 15 up to 25 to life, meaning really doing 15 or 25 years, are women with children and are what we call mules, meaning people that just basically take drugs and go around with them. And I'll give you an example. You might have a drug addict on the street who needs drugs, and he has $3, but he needs $10 of drugs. And the drug dealer, you know, who knows that if he gets caught with, 4 ounces of cocaine, that he will go to jail for life, very well knows, says to this guy, look, you take this to around the corner and bring it to this other guy, and you come back and I'll give you your $10 worth of drugs. Now that guy who's walking around with the drugs, the mere possession of that, which could easily get him 15 to life, and certainly something like 3 to life, which means a lot more than 3 usually, that person is really an innocent victim of the entire system. And that person may not be eligible for DTAP because of a large quantity of drugs. So it's really important that we look at these drug laws and say, do we really want this person to go to jail for 3 years? Or do we want this person, do we want to reconsider that as somebody who should get treatment? Or who should get a lesser sentence? How about 1 to 3 or something like that, you know? A little bit of time, just enough to get you, you can't be selling drugs, you can't be walking around big quantities. But not so much to ruin somebody's life or make it so that they can't come back. The biggest problem in my heart of hearts, really, is the women. There are a lot of women who really get caught up in drugs, in large quantities of drugs, because of the men that they're with. And I'm not trying to say men are bad, but I will say that I think, if you would hear some of the stories of some of the women, a lot of this is connected to domestic violence. That women who are victims of domestic violence sometimes have, their husbands or their significant others in the home with drugs, and they really don't have a way to sort of get out of the whole problem of what's happening in their house. And they know the drugs are there, and in fact sometimes actually work with their husbands, helping their husbands actually, work the drugs, splitting the drugs up, bringing the drugs places, hiding the drugs, and doing things that are actually technically against the law, and do get them 15 years to life. I was once on trial in a case, and I was watching another trial go on. It was a woman who, that's exactly what happened to her. Her husband was selling drugs. I don't know if she was a victim of domestic violence, but I suspect she probably was. And he was keeping the drugs in the home. She was arrested. He was arrested. He hired a lawyer to take her case. He had the money and he hired a lawyer for her. And her lawyer never really understood what was going on because she never really told her lawyer that it was really his drugs. And she didn't feel like she could tell that lawyer because he was being paid for by the husband. Now this woman ends up getting convicted, and she's doing 15 to life. And now it all eventually comes out what's going on. The judge finds out, and there's nothing that the judge can do. So when you add up the people who are really negatively affected by these drug laws, who are not drug addicts, I think the conclusion has to be reached that we as a society really can't tolerate the mandatory minimum sentences that are currently on the books. It's just really unacceptable. You as soon-to-be lawyers have to really understand that the legal profession has to take a very strong role in changing laws that are unfair. That the system that's currently operating in our state government is unfortunate because it doesn't really expedite, I think, the changing of laws that are no longer supported by the population. I can tell you that every one of you in this room, the DA and myself are both here saying let's change the laws. It's not like there's a big dispute here that they have to be changed. There may be some details we disagree with, but basically everybody knows these laws should really be modified and substantially changed. The perception might be that you're soft on crime if you change this law, and one legislator might be afraid to be seen that way, or the governor might be afraid to be seen that way in an election year, and then you basically have state assembly members who are being elected in every 2 years, and they're afraid to do it on an election year. And we now have year after year after year going by where everybody's up there in Albany saying, drop the rock, right? It's like a big thing, and it's not happening. So I really welcome the opportunity to sort of educate people who are coming into the profession and to make you feel that you should be involved in looking at criminal justice issues that are very important, that are affecting people in our society every day. And thinking about what you've heard and thinking about what you think, but also taking action, and don't be afraid to be involved. Now, one other thing I really wanted to say was about I think that, just going back to treatment for a minute, I think effective drug treatment programs really require the cooperation of all the different members of the system. That as a defense attorney, I'm on a committee to plan a new drug court, that the DA has a certain perspective, the defense, we have different information, but we sort of all agree, and that the courts are involved also. And if the Rockefeller laws are changed just so that the DA has the discretion to put somebody in treatment, but not but the judge doesn't really. But I think you sort of exclude, I mean, the judge sort of has to agree, but you sort of exclude the court system from the process of determining who should get treatment and what the penalty should be for people who, let's say, slip backwards, or what should happen to people afterwards. And I think it's very important that we incorporate, everybody, because the treatment providers, the people that monitor, the DA's Office of Defense, these programs work best when everybody sort of collaborates and throws their 2 cents in. So, sort of a little complicated about how exactly they're going to reform these laws. But I know you'll all help support these reforms. And, I don't know what anybody can do, but I know there's a Drop the Rock Day coming where we will actually lobby in Albany. And I welcome you to, actually, I'll send you a flyer, and I welcome any of you to come. Any of you can contact me personally if you're interested in this issue. We welcome the support. The New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers has a student membership. I don't know if you want to be DAs or if you're interested in defense. But, I think it's really important to, start looking at these issues if you're interested in criminal justice. So, thanks for speaking.
There seems to be an association between narcotics and addiction, and I think that one of the things in the Rockefeller drug laws that gets overlooked is that marijuana has been considered a narcotic legally, but not medically. There's no medical association, and many states have tried to lessen this burden. I think taking marijuana out of that class of narcotics also relieve burdens, considering that alcohol is a form of getting high and it's legalized. Tobacco, don't forget, when alcohol was illegal, people that possessed alcohol went to jail. When it became legalized or decriminalized, the criminal element was taken away. And there's less violence associated with it, which is a key component of getting into the program. You cannot be a violent offender. So when taking that out of the Rockefeller mix, alleviate some burdens on the system, save some money, and really acknowledge the reality that Reefer Madness movie is not true. And if you saw the movie, they freak out. But people smoke cigarettes, which is laden with nicotine, a stimulant, a drug. People drink alcohol, a stimulant, a drug.
And more people die from those drugs than all the other
Right, alcohol-related death. You can drink a bottle of tequila, and you're okay. You're ready to fight. But I never saw anyone smoke pot and go up shooting people. So.
I'll throw that in your list.
Yeah.
It's, drug treatment advocates, people who run drug programs will tell you that marijuana is a gate, what's the expression?
Gateway.
A gateway drug, and so is booze, so is cigarette. I mean, Joe Califano became a nationally recognized guru on substance abuse because he woke up one day and realized he couldn't stop smoking. And it drove him nuts, because he's so smart. And he just launched incrementally one new crusade at a time. And now, thank goodness he's involved in the reform of these laws. Look, we could talk this thing to death. It ain't going to happen the way my colleagues suggest, because the Assembly says one thing, the Senate says another, and that's where they are. And it's not going to change, and that's why I said that the detail is the devil itself. What I suggest is, if I can convince Bob Barr and Strom Thurmond that there should be reform of drug laws based on detail, I think we can convince anybody. And just parenthetically, you should understand, I don't have to see a jot or a tittle change in the Rockefeller drug laws. They don't affect a thing I do, because everything I do is pre-indictment. Once there's an indictment, I lose all my discretion. But before indictment, I can do whatever I want. Yeah.
What does Brooklyn's DTaP program do with that relapse that is so common.
this softy over there lets people back into the program. So one of the problems I'm dealing with, and I know you didn't support me last year, that's all right. I'm a recovering defense attorney, so I'm inclined to have a much different approach to resolution of crime. You know, you talk about the judicial discretion. I've said it to Shelley Silver, let me appeal inappropriate placements. Give me that. No, can't happen.
One other question,
Yeah.
why is it, given the immense success of the DTAP program, that the other DAs in the city are not receptive?
Good. It might surprise you. I met with 10 district attorneys 2 weeks ago at our winter conference. I picked them randomly. Made a few people angry because they weren't invited. I picked 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. One of the Republicans was a guy named Kent Bruno. Similar name to the Senate Majority Leader. He's the son. And I said, what do you think? You know, here is a proposal for federal drug reform. The consensus was, yeah, let's take a shot. We're now having a meeting with the executive committee Thursday up in Albany. And I've already spoken to a number of my colleagues. That's the problem. You see, the New York Times continuously writes incorrectly that we are opposed because we're a bunch of Neanderthals. It's just nonsense. The Albany Times Union writes the same stuff. The Rochester DNC, you know, good people. I mean, I know some of these people because I know. In my former life, I had 2 failed statewide campaigns, which I will never do again. So I'll be here till I die. But I mean, most of my colleagues are in favor of the reform. So, you know, I think we're on the way to have a serious shot at legislative reform this year. The problem is it's not going to satisfy Lisa or my other colleagues in the Defense Association the way we're proposing it, but I think it's the best thing we can do right now. I mean, all the stuff she talks about, you know, these penalties for people who are not drug addicted. I mean, those are the kinds of things that ought to be looked at individually. I've always been opposed to mandatory jail sentences. For God's sake, we pay a lot of money to judges and district attorneys. You know, we're not automatons, for heaven's sake. Let us exercise our discretion.
No, I won't comment on
Yeah.
that as well. I think there's an unfortunate, ugly little undercurrent to drug arrests and mandatory minimums that, you know, really doesn't happen much in Brooklyn, but happens around the country and especially in federal court, which is the idea that if somebody gets arrested for drugs, they can turn in people that they know who also are involved in the drug trade higher up. And there are many district attorneys who actually really believe that if I don't have this life sentence hanging over this guy's head, I'll never get him to tell me where he gets the drugs from, and I can't then go up. Okay, now, you know, it's ugly. It's really ugly. It's very, very common in federal court. You know, the minimum is 10 years or 20 years, and they say, all right, we'll give you a downward departure, and now you'll get, you know, 20 months if you just, you know, flip. And they have a lot of, you know, DAs who are really saying, you know, this is an important arsenal, you know, weapon in our arsenal against the drug trade. Personally, you know, I think it's very ugly for society because what happens is you have, especially in some place like Brooklyn, you know, you have these communities that are very, very poor, and there's a lot of drug selling and drug using going on in the communities. And if you get one guy, he's sort of snitching on this guy who he like grew up with a lot of times, you know. And then you have these families who know each other, and the communities themselves are not very strong. So now you have people sort of turning on each other, and you have one family now afraid of another family when they used to, you know, when they watch their kids grow up together. And you know, I just find that it's a destructive, you know, mechanism, and the best mechanism to get rid of the drug trade is to get rid of the demand, right? I mean, that's really your bottom line. So I do think, I mean, it's not that, I can't speak, you know, that those, you know, the other DAs are not willing to, you know, change the Rockefeller laws, but I do believe there is something, you know, a little insidious about their lack of desire to jump on the bandwagon, you know, full force. You know, I'm glad you got that. So let's see what we can do.
I mean, the National DA's Association, you know, many of whom are Republican conservatives, have supported the legislation of the Congress. Because whatever else you might think about those people who want to subscribe to the philosophical position of Republican conservatives, they know fiscal impact. I mean, the people who support DTAP in the Congress are not doing it because they're soft-hearted liberals. They see the money going down the drain, and they see nothing being accomplished by it.